Today I'm carving bar stools out of cedar. I have a bunch of cedar 6x6s left over from a landscaping project. I cut them down to length using my 10-inch compound miter saw, but I have to make a few passes to get all the way through since they are 5.5 inches thick. These pieces are really rough, so I gave them a light sanding with 60 grit just to knock down some of the splinters and hopefully to make them a little easier to glue together. I want the bar stool to be about 28 to 30 inches tall, so I cut the pieces to more manageable lengths and started the rough carving. I used my reciprocating saw to make some vertical cuts, and now it's really easy to chip out big pieces with a machete. This is actually a really fast way to remove a lot of material, and once you make those vertical cuts, a light swing with a machete really sends a lot of material flying. If you want to be more precise and maybe produce some scrap that you could use for other projects, it is possible to do this all with the reciprocating saw. It just requires a little more precision and a lot of vibrations from the saw. And you gotta watch out when you release that bungee cord so it doesn't smack you in the knuckles. I rough carved 4 pieces and now I'm going to glue them together. I started with the first 2 and then flipped that over and used a real heavy amount of glue. Again, these pieces of wood are pretty rough and not perfectly flat on the surfaces, so I did a very unelegant glue up. One of my favorite pieces of equipment isn't a tool. It's this 3-hand VersaFlow helmet. I really like it because it gets hot out here and typical dust masks or face masks can fog up. And this thing has a little battery pack on the belt that powers a fan system. Now I can use my angle grinder to smooth out the rough carving. I use this spiny looking sea urchin type attachment and I've had really good results with it. It lasts a really long time and it removes material, particularly in a softwood like cedar, really fast. After smoothing out the lines, I started to focus on giving the piece an hourglass profile. This is where I'm really digging into the middle and trying to create the thinnest point in the stool. You can carve really fast, but when you're designing as you're carving, it tends to make you slow down a little bit, so I never tried to get too aggressive with any one step. I know this is chunkier than I want it to be, but I decided to switch from focusing on the profile to starting to eliminate some of those flat faces. I want the design to be really organic, and so wherever I had a flat face, I started carving away at it to give it a more fluid appearance. I alternate between concave and convex carving strategies with the end goal to have these 2 types of curvatures blended together. I'm basically just looking at the piece and seeing where does it look a little too blobby for my taste. And then that's where I come in and try to scoop it out, which then creates these ridges in between the scoops, which hopefully will pick up some shadow lines and give it that kind of sinewy, organic aesthetic. Sometimes it's hard for me to look at something that's lying on its side and imagine what it's going to look like when it's standing up at a kitchen counter. So I wanted a way to clamp the piece down nice and secure, but in an upright position. I also didn't want typical bar clamps to get in the way of the angle grinder. So I threw together some scrap wood and then used a ratchet strap to put pressure down on the piece. Now I can kind of stand back, take a look at it, but still have 360-degree access to carve all the way around it. I find that my designs turn out a lot better when I have really good real-time visibility. I realized the piece was a little too tall for my countertop height, so to trim it, I just cut part of the way through with my circular saw, chipped off some pieces with a hatchet, and then used a handsaw to power the rest of the way through. All of this is fun and games with cedar. I wouldn't want to do this with a real hardwood. Now that I got the height right, I can start carving a curved recess in the stool's top. To hold the piece steady, I just used a couple bags of concrete to weight it down on either side. This scoop should make the stool a little more comfortable, and it'll also break up the flatness visually. It still feels a little bit blobby, and I think I was being too conservative. I was worried about the middle getting too thin and the whole thing breaking, but now that I can feel how strong it is, I'm going to get a little more aggressive with the carving. It's hard to make a bottom perfectly flat, so I scooped out a little bit of the underside, and this just makes it a little easier for it to sit flat on the floor. You really just need the perimeter for the stability of the stool, so don't worry about scooping out a little of the middle. The angle grinder is fast, but it carves really rough, and it's so easy just to lean in a little too hard and dig out too much. So I switched to my orbital sander to really smooth out the carving marks from the angle grinder and start to contour the lines and blend everything together. Sometimes in this phase though, I feel like I blend too much and I start to get it to be blobby again. And I find that it's really helpful to work in lighting conditions that are similar to the place where the piece will be presented. Here you can see the difference between the side that's been sanded with the orbital sander and the rough carved side from the angle grinder. The glue up was strong, but it wasn't perfect considering how rough these beams were, so I did have to go in with some wood putty on some of the cracks. You'll definitely see the seams on the piece. There's no illusion to trying to hide those, and you'll see the wood putty as well. I think it still looks good, and I like this kind of rough patchwork design aesthetic, especially when it's contrasted with the fluid curves. But I gotta make more of these stools, and I got some ideas about design and process changes. Some of those even include lighting stuff on fire. I thought a lot about the type of finish that I want to use for these stools. Aesthetically, a clear coat would probably give me the finish that best emphasizes these fluid curves. But these stools are probably going to take quite a bit of abuse, and for sure people's feet dangling off of them are going to bump into it. So I went with the oil and wax simple finish, which is great when you have a piece that you want to get a little abused and develop a patina over time. This kind of finish is really easy to repair, and it also doesn't involve as many chemicals as a typical clear coat. The top is where the wood putty is most evident, and it does have a nice warm patchwork kind of aesthetic. But for the next set of stools, don't really want to plane them down to get a tighter glue line. I just don't have a great thickness planer to do that. So instead, I'm going to try a different aesthetic technique to define the seams even more. Sometimes instead of trying to hide a flaw, I just turn it into a feature. And so I decided to light a bunch of these cedar pieces on fire. I've seen a lot of charred finishes on the outside of projects, but what I'm going to do here is char the insides of those seams. These beams are really splintery, and not only will the fire give me a black outer coating, it'll also knock down all those splinters. Now you could just stand there and go inch by inch over the beams with the torch, but what I like to do is just place these things on my metal sawhorses, douse them with rubbing alcohol or lighter fluid, and then just let them burn. I want a charred surface that's between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch deep. This way I can kind of scrape off the loose soot and char and really clamp the pieces together to get a solid glue up, but still maintain some blackness so that we can really see the seam. This also means that I need a wood glue that's black. And since wood glue is water-based, I just added some India ink to some Titebond Type 3, blended it together with my drill, and got a very dark gray wood glue that cures almost to a perfect black, but definitely black enough. I've added water-based dyes a few times to wood glues, and it probably weakens it somewhat, but I've never really had too much of an issue with it. I applied a very liberal coat between the charred logs, then clamped them together 2 at a time before combining all 4 into a single chunk of wood. If I still have some gaps after I'm done carving, instead of using a wood putty, I'll probably come in with an epoxy that has black pigment in it. 1, I think that'll give me a little extra strength, and 2, it'll keep those seam lines nice and dark. The other thing that I want to experiment with for this next round of stools is reducing waste and changing the nature of how I derive the form. So rather than cutting out notches in the middle of 4 pieces, this time I'm cutting slices of a log, and then we'll combine all 8 slices to make the blank for 1 stool. Theoretically, this should reduce the waste by about 20 to 30%, but it will make the glue up a little bit more challenging. That being said, I'm really happy with the first stool. It looks great, especially against the concrete backdrop of my new kitchen island, and I'm very excited to see how the next 2 come out. So stay tuned, make sure you subscribe to this channel so you can follow along. Okay,